Maybe elections, including democratic elections, work well at lower levels of government. But at higher levels of government, we should have a system that is meritocratic and that selects and promotes officials with superior qualities. That's going to be the conclusion, but I'm going to argue in favor of that. What are the reasons for this conclusion? Let's go to the next slide, please. So again, why is political meritocracy the appropriate standard? In China, whether it's intellectuals or political reformers, basically there's a view that there's no one-size-fits-all solution. It depends on the country's history, political culture, national conditions, size and level of government. And in this case, political meritocracy is the appropriate standard for mid to higher levels of government. Why? Let's go to the reasons. Next slide, please. So it depends on the size of the country, right? I mean, in a very tiny country or community, the voters have the people have direct knowledge of who their leaders are. They know who's corrupt, who's not, who's more likely to be a good person, who's more able, and who's not. So in that context, arguably, there's a much better case to have much more democratic mechanisms to select leaders because the people are well informed about the qualities of their leaders. So this is not a crazy view. I mean, in the West as well, like Jean-Jacques Rousseau, his famous book, The Social Contract, which is a strong defense of participatory democracy, but he argues that it works well only in a small community. When he was asked to be political advisor to a larger community, Poland, and he wrote a book about it, not as well known, called The Government of Poland, basically there he defended something that's much closer to political meritocracy. Because in a huge community, at the higher levels of government, first of all, there's a huge gap between the people and the leaders, and the issues are much more complex. The leaders need lots of experience and training to make more well-informed decisions. I mean, think of China at the highest levels of government. The leaders have to think about issues like climate change. What are the interests of future generations? And that, that's part of what's motivating this huge transition to green technology in China. They need to think about the interests of other countries that are affected by policies. And the issues require lots of knowledge of economics, of environmental science, as well as you have to be well informed by history and even by philosophy in order to make well-informed political decisions. So at higher levels of government, it makes much more sense for the leaders to be selected by meritocratic mechanisms that require long decades of experience at lower levels of government and a good track record of political judgment. So this is one reason. China is a huge country. And there should not be one way of selecting political leaders. At lower levels of government, there's a much stronger case for democratic mechanisms, and at higher levels, stronger case for meritocratic mechanisms. Let's look at another reason. Next slide, please. Political culture matters, right? When you're thinking about what's an ideal political system, it's not just sitting in a chair and thinking about an abstract view. It has to fit with the dominant political culture. If the dominant political culture rejects your ideas, then there's something wrong with your ideas, not with the political culture. You have to think about how to fit what you say to the dominant views in that community. And in China, the dominant ideal has been political meritocracy. Going back more than 2,500 years ago, whether it's the Confucians, the Maoists, even the Taoists to a certain extent, there's a widespread agreement that the best way to select leaders is through these meritocratic mechanisms. And even the ideal political community, there's this book, the Book of Rights, the Li Ji, which describes the ideal community. And even in this ideal community, they say, there's these lines in Chinese, xuan xian yu neng, which means that even in this ideal political community, which is a kind of almost communist society, but unlike Marx, the state won't wither away at higher levels of government, even at the best, the most ideal community, we need to select virtuous and capable officials. That's the ideal, and it's been implemented, again, highly imperfectly, throughout history by means of a complex meritocratic system that aims to select and promote even I keep on slipping to that, meritocratically selected officials. And the most famous mechanism, of course, is the imperial examination system, the Keju, which was invented about 1,300 years ago and then implemented in diverse forms throughout Chinese history until the whole system collapsed in 1905. And not surprisingly, the whole imperial system collapsed shortly thereafter. But again, that system has been revived over the past few decades. Let's go to the next slide, please. Again, the past few decades, there's much, much, much more emphasis now on selecting and promoting leaders who have education, who are selected through examinations, and who have a proven record at lower levels of government. So even the translation here is a bit misleading. Actually, it's the official Chinese translation, says civil service. But you have to remember, in China, there's no distinction between civil service and political leaders. You know, think of Canada, where I'm from. Probably Brazil is roughly similar to the Canadian system, where we select leaders, political leaders, by means of elections. But when it comes to civil servants, we can use examinations. We can use meritocratic mechanisms to select them. But in principle, the civil servants are supposed to obey the elected leaders, right? That's how it works in principle. So China has had great influence on the civil service systems in England, in France, and in the US and elsewhere, because Chinese-style meritocratic systems were used to select civil servants. But in China, in Imperial China, and still now, there's no clear distinction between civil servants and political leaders. All of the public officials are selected by means of meritocratic mechanisms. So a better translation here would be public official examinations. Again, there's no distinction between civil servants and political leaders. All of them are supposed to be selected through examinations and other meritocratic mechanisms, such as political experience at lower levels of government. Let's go to the next slide, please. And you have to admit, what the people think matters too, right? In survey after survey, the Chinese people, by majority, tend to uphold the ideals of political meritocracy. They want leaders who are capable and virtuous, and they don't care so much about the fact that those leaders are not selected by means of elections. And by the way, they also care about leaders who are corrupt. If corruption is bad in China, it undermines the whole political system, because the people expect their leaders to be virtuous, and minimum means don't be corrupt, don't misuse public resources for your family interest. In systems that rely on elections to select leaders, corruption is bad, but it's not, so to speak, an existential threat to the political system, because, well, we can have next elections and maybe the leaders won't be so corrupt after that. So that's why you have countries, like big countries like India and Indonesia. I mean, according to, for example, Transparency International, they're actually more corrupt than China, but corruption is not an existential threat in those countries. It is in China, because if the political leaders are corrupt, it undermines the whole meritocratic system, and the people want meritocracy, and therefore it really poses a threat to the system. It's not just me who's saying that. That's why the leaders in China said, if we don't deal with corruption, the whole system will collapse. That helps explain this anti-corruption campaign, which has been going on for more than a decade now. Let's go to the next slide, please. Now, well, another reason why political meritocracy is an appropriate standard is that, unlike certain forms of non-democratic systems, like absolute monarchy, well, actually, political meritocracy is compatible with many democratic mechanisms, such as elections at lower levels of government. In China, 800 million farmers have used one person, one vote to select leaders in villages. The other democratic mechanisms, such as deliberation and consultation. Now there's a lot about sortition in China as a way of selecting leaders. All those systems are compatible to a certain extent with meritocratic mechanisms. The only incompatibility in the Chinese system anyway is that it's not compatible with democratic elections at the very highest levels. Because think about it, what are the advantages of political meritocracy? Well, all of the leaders have political experience. But if you use democratic elections to select top leaders, they might select some with no political experience, like Donald Trump before he was first president in 2016, had zero political experience. That wouldn't happen in China. In China, all the leaders can take long-term decisions because they don't have to worry so much about the next elections, right? So for example, on issues like climate energy, it's been going on actually for at least 20 years. There's been these plans to shift away from this kind of heavy oil and coal reliance to more green energy. The Chinese leaders can take this long-term horizon because they don't have to worry about losing power in the next 3 or 4 years. So again, if elections were to be used to select leaders of the highest government, it would undermine some of those key advantages of political meritocracy. And also, frankly, leaders can spend time on thinking about how to solve problems. They don't have to worry so much about campaigning and giving the same speech over and over again, or trying to raise money so that they do well in elections. So again, yes, political meritocracy is compatible with most democratic mechanisms, except for elections at the highest levels of government, because that would undermine the advantages of political meritocracy. Let's go to the next slide, please. The final reason why political meritocracy is an appropriate standard in the Chinese context, especially, is that in a modern system, especially, the things change so fast. And so think about, financial global shocks, think about climate change, think about AI, how that will radically transform our way of life. We can be sure that we don't know about the future, but we can be sure that 20 years from now, it will be completely different. So the institutions that we have now may not be suitable 20 years from now. There's a need, but what won't change is the need for high quality leaders, leaders that take long-term outlook, and that think about some of these issues in a deeper way, and that have experience in making good decisions at lower levels of government. That's not going to change. So in fact, the case for political meritocracy, I would argue, is even stronger now than it was a few years ago because of the fact that things change so fast. So again, to recap my main argument, political meritocracy is an appropriate standard for judging progress and regress in China at the highest levels of government, not necessarily in other countries, because it depends on the size of the country, on the political culture, on the recent experience of political reform, on what the people think, and there are some more general reasons as well, such as the compatibility with most forms of democracy and the fact that political meritocracy is required, perhaps more so now than ever before. Now let's go to the next topic. So you guys, well, what does that mean? Political meritocracy is a little bit vague. Which qualities matter for political leaders, and how can we best assess and measure those qualities? Well, again, you have to look at social science to make those points. Look at history. Look at political theorizing, normative theorizing, and then we can come up with some informed ideas along those lines. So what are some of these key qualities? Let's go to the next slide, please. Next. So there's no universal answer. It depends on the context, right? If you're a good leader in business, maybe like, for example, Donald Trump, or a good leader in religion, it doesn't necessarily make you a good political leader. I mean, think about business. If you're good at making money, that means you want to select the high performers, get rid of the ones that are performing not so well. But if you're a political leader, it's almost the opposite. You need to care about those who the least advantaged, who can't help themselves, who need help from the government. And the rich and powerful don't need help from the government. So the government has to pay special attention to what, well, John Rawls called the worst off, but the Confucians also say that we should care about those who need help, who don't have family members to care for them. The qualities required of business leaders and political leaders are quite different. If you're a good leader in times of war, like, for example, Chairman Mao, he was a great leader in times of war because he had courage, he had a certain degree of recklessness, and so on, which maybe in times of war may be a good virtues, but in times of peace, those are not appropriate virtues. Often you need to be cautious and think about the long term and so on. And of course, if you're a good leader in a small community, it doesn't mean you're a leader in a large, you'd be a good leader in a large country. So it's very contextual. So let's go to the next slide, please. So the question to ask in a Chinese context is, what are the qualities most appropriate for leaders at higher levels of government in a large country, and how best to assess those qualities? These are relevant questions for the Chinese context. Next slide, please. So the first and most obvious is high, let's call it analytical ability, because the issues are so complex. Again, if you're at the high levels of government in China, you have to think about issues like think about climate change, which really requires tremendous amounts of, well, scientific knowledge, long-term knowledge of international relations, environmental science, and how people think, and so on. How do you select those leaders? Well, this is where the examinations, they're not, of course, examinations are not perfect, but at least they're a good way of filtering out those who have, let's just say, below average IQ. And also the virtue of examinations that they give a fair and equal opportunity to all. Again, this is one similar to voting in this way. You know, voting gives equal opportunity to all. Examinations also give equal opportunity to all to put them on the road to political power. It's a similar. So if you want to test for IQ, let's put it this way, eliminate those who have below average IQ, then examinations are a good mechanism. What about the next? Let's go to the next slide, please. But in politics, in academia, if you're a great physicist, you need to have tremendous, very high IQ, obviously. But whether you're good at dealing with people is not so important, right? But in politics, it matters because you spend most of your time dealing with other people, trying to persuade people. In China, for example, there's this collective leadership. And I served as dean, by the way, in a public university in China, and we had a form of collective leadership. You spend most of your day in meetings trying to persuade different stakeholders, and if you can't deal well with people, if you don't have a high-level EQ, so to speak, emotional intelligence, you won't be successful. So, for this, examinations are not a good way of testing. But if you do well at lower levels of government, it means usually that you're good at dealing with people. And by the way, social scientific evidence shows that EQ improves with age. So in this sense, it's not a bad idea to use performance evaluations at lower levels of government, as well as giving more power to people as they age, other things being equal. Also, frankly, there's another social science finding that women usually have higher EQ than men. That would be a case for having more women in the Chinese government, of which, frankly, this is a huge problem now. It's almost at the high levels, almost all dominated by men. So again, if we care about this ideal of political meritocracy, it means having more women at high levels of government. Next slide, please. Even most important at the end of the day is having virtue. At least, it doesn't mean you have to be a sage, but you have to be willing to serve the people, not be completely selfish person, not be corrupt, and show some willingness to serve the people, to care about the people, and to implement policies that benefit the people. The question is, how do you select virtue? Well, here examinations are not very good. Even performance evaluations at lower levels of government is not always good, because sometimes if you please your boss can be happy, but the subordinates won't know that you're mean. The boss won't know that you're mean to subordinates. But who is good at assessing moral character? Here we look at history and we look at social science. Look at how meritocratic organizations like the US military, lots of things wrong with the US, but the military is a very meritocratic organization. How do they select their leaders? By asking the peers, because you spend most of your time dealing with people at similar level. They tend to know who's good and who's not, who's capable, who's not. So a very important way of selecting virtuous leaders, at least deselecting those who are not virtuous, is by having more peer input when it comes to selecting leaders. Of course, other clear mechanisms such as higher salaries for public officials would reduce the risk of corruption is important. Let's go to the next slide, please. So moral education is also important. This is where the Confucian heritage is so important because, of course, in Imperial Chinese history, examinations were used to select leaders except for the emperor himself. Well, there's one case of a female emperor too, but they went through rigorous Confucian education, which was meant to improve the quality of the emperor. So basically, moral education is important too for ensuring, or at least not ensuring, but for increasing the likelihood that leaders won't be corrupt. That's one reason now why in China, many of the leaders, as part of the anti-corruption campaign, are being trained more and more in the Confucian classics. There's an assumption that if you learn about the classics, you're less likely to be corrupt. There's even some very interesting statistics, by the way, that the leaders who have degrees in Chinese studies, meaning that they learn the Chinese classics, are less likely to be corrupt just because they learn more about this Confucius emphasis on clean government. Let's go to the next slide, please. So again, there's still lots of corruption in China. There's a huge gap between the ideal and the reality. So how can we reduce those gaps? Let's go to the next slide, please. What are the disadvantages of political meritocracy? We have to be frank and talk about the disadvantages as well. And how can if we agree that electoral democracy at the high levels of government would undermine the advantages of political meritocracy, then we need to ask, how can those disadvantages be minimized without elections? So let's turn to some ideas here. Next slide, please. So or put it this way, how can we limit the abuses of power? So China has a long experience dealing with this problem. Of course, very imperfect. You've had lots of problems with corrupt leaders and with violent and immoral leaders and so on. But again, compared to what? I mean, if you compare to like ancient Rome or ancient Greece, frankly, the Chinese record, not to mention, you know, the parts of, you know, let's say European history, like say the Dark Ages, where there's been no clear political or bureaucratic system in place, China has done not so badly compared to them. But how? How can you prevent abuse of power without competitive elections? Let's go to the next slide, please. So in Imperial China, you had these very interesting mechanisms where the power of emperors was limited by, the emperor had two historians who followed his, again, and her, one exception, one female emperor, every move. There's one who recorded all the actions of the emperors and the other who recorded all the words. So the emperor knew and cared about how he or she would be judged by history, and that served to limit abuses of power to a certain extent. In the modern period, you have different means. The most famous, I think, is collective leadership. Even now, right? You have, people say it's been undermined. I think it's still there to a very important extent. You have, in this case now, you have 7 people at the highest levels of government, the standing committee. Of course, you have one who has more power than the others, but the others have tremendous power as well. And they have to deliberate about policies over and over again before and form a consensus among themselves, among the 7 members of the Standing Committee of the Politburo before it's implemented. And this collective leadership, again, I mentioned it also works at different levels of government. I worked in a huge public university. I was dean, but we couldn't implement decisions without collective leadership. We had meetings with 4 vice deans, 4 party secretaries, and we have to deliberate over and over again. It would reduce the risk of bad ideas, and it would reduce the risk of abuses of power by one person. And then once we form a consensus among ourselves, then we would promote it in the university as a whole. You have other mechanisms, term limits. Of course, that's being challenged to an extent, at least at the highest levels of government. And a retirement age has also helped to limit abuses of power. Let's go to the next slide, please. Now, the anti-corruption drive in China, again, because corruption posed an existential threat to the whole system, which is informed by this ideal of political meritocracy, you had very harsh punishments meted out to those who were corrupt. And this has led to problems. I mean, it's been effective to a certain extent, but it's also led to lots of conservatism where public officials are afraid to make decisions because if they stand out a little bit, it's easy to be exposed or for enemies to claim that there's been corruption and so on. So to a certain extent, it's excessive, let's call them, in the Chinese tradition, legalism, fajia, which means harsh punishments to control people. It's had disadvantages, actually, in the anti-corruption campaign. So let's go to the next slide, please. So now, before I say that, so now there's been much more emphasis now on moral self-regulation. Well, another problem with political meritocracy is that it could lead to ossification of political hierarchy, where examinations, yes, everybody has equal opportunities to participate in examinations, but if it turns out that in practice, to be a leader, you have to come from a powerful family, well, that undermines the workings of political meritocracy. Social mobility gives it legitimacy, not just in Imperial China, but now. The whole system is viewed as legitimate because there's an assumption that regardless of family background, you could rise up if you have ability and virtue, or conversely, you could be demoted if you lack those. But there's a problem that throughout Chinese history, there's been an ossification of political hierarchy. Let's go to the next slide, please. So it's very interesting. Whenever you've had ossification of political hierarchies, you've had the institutions challenged with new institutions emerging. So initially, in 2,000 years ago, you had a recommendation system to select leaders. If you were filial, for example, you'd be recommended at lower levels of community and you'd be promoted. And then there was another system, once that system became ossified, called the nine-rank system. And eventually the imperial examination system were responses. So it's very interesting in Chinese history. The ideal doesn't change, the ideal of political meritocracy, but whenever there's an ossification of political hierarchies, new institutions are invented so that to break down the old hierarchies and open up new possibilities. And arguably that's going on now too. Let's go to the next slide, please. Today, the huge problem in China is that if you're from a poor part of China or rural part of China, even though you could theoretically take the examinations, but if you don't have good teachers and good schools and time to study, it's very hard to do as well on the examinations that put you on the road to political power. So there's a need to address the issues of inequality between rich and poor, rural and urban, to make the system more legitimate. That's part of what's going on in China now. Over the past few years especially, there's been a serious effort to reduce absolute poverty, to reduce gap between rich and poor, and to give more educational opportunities to people from disadvantaged backgrounds. Again, highly imperfect, but at least the problem is recognized and is being addressed to a certain extent. Let's go to the next slide, please. Another problem of political meritocracy is that it's not so easy to justify to those outside the political system. If you do well in a political meritocracy, of course, you tend to believe in it because you think that you went through all these performance evaluations. And people who are part of the system also have respect for those who went through the system. Again, I taught at university, I could see it among the leaders. Those who are at the highest levels usually were respected by others. And maybe there's this tradition of respect for those who went through the meritocratic hoops. But not everybody has respect for them. And people are completely outside the political system. For example, in China, the dominant organization is called, as we know, the Chinese Communist Party. It has 100 million members. That's huge, but the country is 1.4 billion. What about those who are outside the political system? Do they have respect for leaders? Yes, often, but not always. So it's a big question. How can we secure this people's support without electoral democracy? Let's go to the next slide, please. So in the period of reform, that is the past few decades, the rulers have gained support through nationalism, through performance legitimacy, meaning that if you perform well, if you implement policies that serve the people's interests, people will support you. Political meritocracy, again, if the leaders are viewed by the people as being selected by meritocratic mechanisms, this gives them legitimacy. But that's not sufficient. There's still more and more of a need to have more democratic mechanisms, because now the issues are so complex, right? How do you select leaders? In the past, it was not that complicated. You promote economic growth in your district because that was viewed as the best way of reducing poverty. And it was hugely successful, right? In China, 800 million people have been lifted out of poverty. Also, you maintain peace. China hasn't gone to war since 1979. But now the issues are so complex, right? How do you reduce gaps between rich and poor? How do you promote environmental sustainability? And so on. Decide between priorities. So there's a need for more participation to decide between priorities and to give more opportunities for people to participate in government. And that's why now there's an increasing need for more democracy, including lower levels of electoral democracy, mechanisms such as sortition, deliberative polling, and even referenda and so on. This clearly will be a need for the future. Let's go to the next slide, please. But even then, there's going to be a need for the questions. How do you legitimize a political system to those who are completely outside it? And this is why there's been ideas. One, for example, is modernized versions of the Maoist mass line, which means where the leaders deal directly with the people, engage with the people, one-on-one, and have much more avenues for grassroots political participations. There's a lot of discussion in China about that. And also, frankly, you have all the different strands in Chinese political culture, and there's always been this Taoist critique of political meritocracy, saying that the political ways of life are not necessarily the best forms of life. What's wrong with writing poetry, and being on a mountaintop and not caring about politics, So now in China, it's very interesting, and it's in countries that have a strong tradition of political meritocracy, not just China, but Korea and Japan as well. It's very strange. I mean, there's this culture of cuteness. People love cute things. In a way, it's very strange. It's a form of rebellion against political meritocracy. They're saying, we don't care about, rising in a bureaucratic system. We take pride and joy in cute little things that are non-political. And this is perfectly legitimate way of life. This is very interesting counter-reaction to political meritocracy. And frankly, it provides an outlet for the people and helps in that sense, helps to legitimize the political system. It's very interesting. Again, I served as a bureaucrat, and in China, when I wrote message to fellow bureaucrats, I was always add cute little emojis, because that's the way to soften this bureaucratic system. And even in the bureaucracy, we would add this element of this culture of cuteness. I don't know if it's true in Brazil as well. I'd be curious to learn. Next slide, please. So very briefly, I won't spend too much time here. The question is, again, I want to go back to this theme of how to reconcile democracy or political meritocracy. Next slide, please. So yes, again, both are good ideals. The question is how can they be reconciled? Again, next slide, please. So lots of proposals for doing that. I mentioned John Stuart Mill's idea that you give extra votes for educated voters. That's not going to work, because how do you select those voters? And that won't be necessarily viewed as legitimate. You had other proposals where you have, for example, one democratic house of government where the leaders are selected by elections, another house where the leaders may be selected by meritocratic mechanisms such as examinations, or even like, say, a meritocratic kind of House of Lords in the UK. How would that work? Those are not politically unstable, because typically in those contexts, the democratic house always has more legitimacy. But a vertical model where there's more democratic mechanisms at the top and more meritocratic mechanisms at the bottom is both realistic and desirable, especially in a Chinese context. Next slide, please. So again, at the lower levels, to repeat, especially there's a need for more openness, deliberation, transparency, and rule of law. Of course, everybody's in favor of that, right? Of course, in practice, there's a big gap between the ideal and the reality. But I should say, even at the highest levels of government in China, there is this official kind of discourse in favor of all those democratic issues. But again, not at the highest levels of government where the issues are complex and the cost of mistakes are higher. Next slide, please. Again, to repeat myself, at the higher levels of government, it's much more important to have leaders with higher EQ, IQ, and virtue. Next slide, please. But the question is, in China, you have the highest levels of government, which should be more meritocratic, lower levels of government, more democratic. But what about in between? China is a huge country. And here we have to allow for experimentation, because we don't know what works and what doesn't. And part of China's secret is that there's been, since the period of reform, is that there's been this constant experimentation of mechanisms to select and promote leaders. And that's so important, to allow for this experimentation, especially now that we don't know exactly what the standards should be to select leaders. Before it was economic growth, but now it's much more complex, and we need to ensure that there's different experimentation. Next slide, please. Okay, so next slide, please. So again, there's need to have, and who counts? Well, who determines which experiments are successful and which not? Frankly, now it's a bit too politicized. There's a need for more independent evaluation of successful experiments. Next slide, please. So the ideal political system in China, and it's not just me who's saying it, it's just the way, look, it's not, these ideas, all I did is try to make them more systematic. They're not my ideas. It's because when my first job in mainland China was at Tsinghua University in Beijing, where it's the university that selects leaders. Many of the top leaders in China come from Tsinghua. And my colleagues, what were they arguing about? They were arguing about how should we select and promote political leaders? Which virtues matter? Which abilities matter? What's the relation between virtue and ability? And then I decided to write this book, which made these ideas more systematic. So these ideas of democracy at the bottom, experimentation in the middle, and meritocracy at the top, that's one way of making sense of these ideals that my colleagues were arguing about at Tsinghua University. Let's go to the next slide, please. So yeah, I've been arguing it's appropriate for China, but you might want to ask, well, what about other countries? Next slide, please. So again, because there's different ways of selecting leaders at different levels of government, it's not going to work in a small country, right? Like Switzerland, it's much smaller than China. What works in Switzerland may not work in China. So experimentation, what works and what's not, it requires a decades-long horizon. And it's not going to work also with democratic countries with frequent changes of government. And not to mention, that meritocratic decision-making also requires decades-long horizon. So if countries have this strong bias towards electoral democracy, many of these ideas, frankly, are not feasible. Next slide, please. And if you don't have a long history of political meritocracy, with a long history of a complex bureaucratic system, China is the earliest country with a complex bureaucratic system, more than 2,000 years. It's very hard to implement. Again, to implement electoral democracy is not that complicated, even in like a very poor and chaotic country. If you want to have elections, you can do it, right? But to have meritocracy, it requires very complex bureaucracy. That's not so easy to do if you don't have it, if you don't have political culture or a history of bureaucracy. Next slide, please. So how can China, if China wants to promote political meritocracy, what's the best way of doing it? Well, the best way is first you set a good model at home, and you try, and you can inspire other countries by your positive model. You know, China will never, I don't want to be too straight, but it's highly unlikely that China will use force to export its political model. I mean, the US, for example, can and has gone to war to try to promote democracy. China will not go to war to promote political meritocracy. But what it might do is try to set a good model for other countries. And if other countries want to learn, then share experience by, for example, experimentation, and also helping to train public officials. I was the dean of a large faculty of public administration in Shandong University, and we had many students from Ethiopia, from Laos, from other countries that really wanted to learn from the complex bureaucratic system in China. How do we have good, systems for, electrification, or management of water, and how do we select public officials who are less likely to be corrupt? If China is perfectly willing to work with countries that are serious, about learning from this, including in the case of China, providing many scholarships to young public officials who are willing to come to China to learn from its political system. But lots of things wrong with China, but I can promise, it's highly unlikely that China would ever want to invade other countries to promote political meritocracy, because people know that it's quite distinctive to China because of its political culture, because of its size, and because of its history. And it's very hard to promote as a whole to other countries. So I think that's maybe next slide, please. That might be the end. Thank you. And probably lots of things I said here are quite dubious and highly controversial. So please feel free to criticize. And I do very much want to learn from the Brazilian experience. And to what extent some of these ideas may or may not be relevant in Brazil. Thank you.
Thank you, Daniel. Very compelling presentation. I have a few questions from
sorry, I can't hear you too well, Andre, please.
Sorry.
I cannot hear too well, I'm sorry.
Can you listen to me now?
Yeah, now I hear. Yeah.
I was saying thank you for a very compelling presentation. I have a few questions here from the crowd. The first one I would like to ask you is about what do you think now in China are the main sources of political legitimacy for the government? Because we can see, well, as you said, the United States is often very prepared to sound the drums of war when they want to export their political options. And, well, China maybe doesn't have now the same strength to do so. But I think this aspect of nationalism might be something that can explain, in a way, one source of legitimacy for the government. I would like you to elaborate a bit about that. Another question is, what is the role of Confucianism, of this resurgence, maybe, of Confucianism as a source of possible legitimacy? Because the government is trying to use more this tradition to legitimize itself. So this would be the second question. I will put a third question, and then you can answer and maybe we make a quick second round after that. The third question would be, what is your opinion or your observations about Xi Jinping's current political course now in China? What are his main interests, nationally and internationally speaking? So these three first questions for you.
Thank you. Very big and not easy to answer, and somewhat controversial as well. But let me try. So yeah, the source of legitimacy, there's not one source, right? There's several sources. So you mentioned nationalism. It's worth just saying a little bit about the character of nationalism in China. In the West, people worry about China's aggressive nationalism, and it will want to expand to the rest of the world, just like other European and to a certain extent how the American empire is acting now. The source of Chinese nationalism, it's very different. It's confined to the Chinese-speaking world, and it's not just me who's saying that. There's a very good article but in the International Security, and also there's a shortened version in International Affairs lately, the authors, they looked at what's being taught in schools and in China, and what is the official discourse about nationalism, and it's all centered on the Chinese-speaking world, including Taiwan. The idea that people in Chinese schools, they don't learn about this idea that we should want to expand to the rest of the world. They learn that China has been peaceful in most of its history, and that's the way that we want it to remain in the future. But within the Chinese-speaking world, there is almost a universal consensus in China that at some point we want to have one large political community that includes Taiwan. But beyond Taiwan, there's the aggressive, the idea that China would want to expand beyond Taiwan is just off limits. It's just highly, highly, highly unlikely. So there is a nationalism that is confined to pride in having a unified political community in the Chinese-speaking world. That's one form of legitimacy. Another source of legitimacy is, as mentioned, is performance legitimacy. What matters? People judge the political leaders by the results that they deliver. And if they're successful at delivering economic growth, at promoting peace and not going to war, then this provides a very important source of legitimacy. But now that the Chinese economy is not growing as fast as it used to, again, that's not as sufficient or maybe even as strong a source of legitimacy as it used to be. I mentioned the ideal of political meritocracy is important too. I mean, if the leaders are viewed as having been selected and promoted by meritocratic mechanisms, this makes people respect the leaders and provides a very important source of legitimacy. Whereas if they're not viewed as meritocratically selected, then obviously that's a problem. But so far, I don't think it's been a huge issue. I mentioned that various democratic mechanisms also help to provide legitimacy, although frankly, there's a need for much more progress along those lines too. But let me go to the second question about Confucianism. It is also another source of legitimacy. We can call it values-based legitimacy. And the question here is that China is still a Marxist country, as you know, it's the Chinese Communist Party. But Marxism is not viewed as a sufficient source of values-based legitimacy anymore. I think it's still viewed as an important source of legitimacy. I mean, people still take pride in the communist ideals, and to a certain extent, there may also be a view that China's future with AI doing the socially necessary work and people be free to realize their creative talents, and that maybe we can and should move towards some sort of communist ideal. That's still there, but it's not sufficient. Now there's a view that the Chinese political system needs to be viewed as the carrier of a much older tradition, which is grounded in a long civilization of which Confucianism has been the main, let's say, political tradition. So Confucianism is being revived partly by intellectuals in a purely independent way, but also partly by the government, because it provides another source of values-based legitimacy, which complements Marxism as a source of values-based legitimacy. So that also helps explain the revival of Confucianism. And speaking more as an independent intellectual, I'm pleased to say that so far there's not one version of Confucianism that has been promoted by the government, because that would really spell the end of Confucianism as a diverse and vibrant tradition. So there's still lots of room for intellectuals to debate about this rich and diverse tradition, but it's also being employed by the government as to provide a deeper values-based legitimacy for the government. Now, the third question about Xi Jinping, and look, I want to just, I just want to put a little bit of, let's put this question in a broader context. There's this view, like if you read like the dominant media, at least in the Anglophone world, they tend to think it's like one person decides everything in China. She this and she that, and what does he think? What does he not think? Look, China, it's a huge bureaucracy, and even at the very top, there's still some form of collective leadership. So the decisions that are made are not purely the product of one man's thinking, right? Or let's put it this way. It's worth asking, what if a different leader had been in place? Would China's policies be different? Or is it more that's just the organization itself that provides the dominant policies? And I'm inclined to think it's more the latter. Think about what has happened since Xi Jinping assumed power in 2012. What have been the major changes in China? One, this huge anti-corruption campaign. That probably would have happened because corruption was viewed as a real, to repeat myself, existential threat to the political system. If it wasn't dealt with in a serious way, the whole system might collapse. It's not me who's saying it. The leaders prior to 2012 were saying that. There was a need for a really serious drive to deal with corruption so that the system would be viewed as more legitimate and the leaders as more meritocratic and willing to serve the people and not be corrupt. Probably would have happened regardless of who was leader. And frankly, maybe it wouldn't have lasted so long. And maybe the means would have been different, but there would have been a very strong anti-corruption campaign. That would have happened regardless of who was leader. Again, it's counterfactual history, so you can never be completely sure about this, but let me proceed. What other issues? Well, there's been a huge effort to reduce gap between rich and poor. Would that have happened? Yes, I think it would have happened regardless of who's the leader, because that was viewed as a huge problem in China. Before, 2012, there was almost this view that let's have a no-holds-barred economic growth, because that was viewed as the best way of reducing poverty. But it had all these terrible side effects. One is it led to a huge gap between rich and poor. Two, also environmental disasters. There would have been a huge need to promote environmental sustainability. All those things have happened because they were felt as, or let's say they were determined to be the main priorities of the China. And frankly, no matter who the political leader would be, those would have been the priorities of China. So we don't have to worry so much about what one leader thinks and what one leader doesn't think. It's really the organization that sets the priorities. And yes, the leader has, when it comes to particular policies in particular times, the leader has an effect. But on the overall trajectory of China, frankly, it's the organization that matters, not the leader. This is one key characteristic of the Chinese political system. Now, what about Xi Jinping himself? Well, look, I don't know, but my view, it's worth noting that he went through the Cultural Revolution, right? So he saw in some ways the worst sides of human nature, which may have made him a bit more pessimistic than other leaders who were from a later generation. So this might change. I mean, to be a little bit, let's put it a bit this way. Many intellectuals in China do worry about the current trajectory, which seems to have some, let's just be a bit blunt, increased censorship in areas and less openness. And, why is that happening? Well, maybe it's because some leaders from that Cultural Revolution generation have this somewhat paranoid mindset. I mean, that could be it. So the next generation of leaders, we would expect, wouldn't have this kind of mindset and maybe more open and to within the country as well as to the rest of the world. But also, frankly, it's not just China, right? The US is doing almost everything it can, sometimes very openly, to try to curb. Of course, China's technological growth, but even overall economic growth. So naturally, this makes the Chinese leaders more paranoid. And of course, China is surrounded by US military bases too. It's hard to be completely relaxed in that setting. So again, this points to the larger structures as well at work here. If the US were to be, and maybe here Donald Trump is a good thing, he seems to be less hawkish than many other American leaders. If the US were to release its pressure on China, this would also allow for the forces that favor more reform and openness in China to flourish once again. What the outside world cannot shape China, but what it can do is strengthen certain forces in China and allow them to do things that would otherwise be more difficult to do. So one example, when China joined the WTO, the World Trade Organization in China, that means that there was huge unemployment problem because the state-run enterprises had to release millions of workers. But the Chinese leaders could say, those who favored reform, market reform in those days, they could say, look, it's not up to us. Because we joined WTO, we have to do this. We could, in some sense, the implicit line is blame the foreigners. It's happening now to a certain extent because there's this view, which I think is partly or maybe mainly correct, that the US especially is doing all it can to curb China's rise. This strengthens the paranoid forces in China's security apparatus and allows them to do things that would otherwise be difficult to do. Or to be a bit more positive, if the Western powers led by the US relaxed a little bit, welcome China's rise, and work with China to deal with global issues like climate change and regulation of AI and regulation of pandemics and regulation of nuclear weapons, this would strengthen the forces in China's political system that favor more reform and lead to more open political system in China in the future as well. So I guess the overall way for me to answer this question is just to say, I think we need to look at both the structures within China and outside China if we want to, predict the future rather than the personality of one person at the top.
Thank you, Professor. Now we have another round of questions.
Hi, Professor Bell. My name is Cecilia. I'm the co-host of this conference with Professor Ho. It's a great honor for us to have you here. And
sorry, I can't hear. There's an echo.
I'm sorry.
Yeah, just fix that.
Okay.
Oh, where should I look? Yeah. Again. Hi.
Hello.
Hello. Thank you so much for your amazing keynote. And I've written it down so I don't waste a lot of time. But very briefly, I'd like to ask you, how do you respond to the concern that even the most meritocratic systems risk losing moral legitimacy without robust mechanisms for public accountability? That is, without the possibility of being openly challenged or replaced, and how the leaders remain self-critical, protected from, let's say, the epistemic blind spots that power tends to create. So this is my question provocation. Also, I'd like to say in Brazil, we don't have a culture of cuteness, very far from it. And so the youngsters now seem to have a little bit more under the influence of the Asian or Chinese, Japanese culture is very sort of widespread in Brazil. So maybe youngsters will have that, but it does feel very strange for us, this culture of cuteness. And in terms of political meritocracy, being a viable or an option in Brazil at the moment, I mean, I'm no expert, but I would say the chances are very, very slim. We have democracy as a value still very strong, and we've been through dictatorship and we fought for it. And this word means quite a lot for Brazilian people, even if it seems like it has failed us. Okay, thank you so much.
Thank you. Yeah, so let me start from, if you don't mind, from the last point and proceed in order. So again, political culture matters, right? I mean, if in the Brazil context, there's this history of military dictatorship and democracy was viewed as the main alternative, well, then, yeah, I mean, obviously, it would be very the idea that we should have another political system, for example, influenced by the value of political meritocracy, I mean, would seem strange and maybe even dangerous, because there's a risk that once we question democracy, the most likely outcome will be military dictatorship, not political meritocracy. So completely agree with that. But on the other hand, I don't know. I mean, maybe there are parts of the political system that could be adapted in Brazil, just off the top of my head. It's also a big country. Maybe some form of experimentation at mid-levels of government that are somewhat different and point to possibilities that are not there yet. I mean, maybe those sorts of issues could be foreseeable, right? Without questioning electoral democracy at the top or even or at the bottom. I'm just off the top of my head. Now, about the culture of cuteness. So it's a reaction against this excessive political meritocracy. So political meritocracy, it influences the political system, but it also influences the whole society, because the whole educational system is so ultra competitive in China, right? And the kids from a very young age spend their lives preparing for examinations after examinations after examinations. And this puts them on the road both to political power and to jobs in government, and also good jobs in the economy. If you're viewed as graduate of a top university in China, it's much easier to get good jobs in finance, for example. So it's an ultra competitive society. And that's why the counter reaction to that is this culture of cuteness. So countries that don't have this ultra competitive society, like if you look at the happiness index, like what are the countries at the top, like Denmark and Finland, they're much more relaxed. They're not ultra competitive. I've been to them. I haven't been to Brazil, but I've been to those happy. In France, I mean, they're much more relaxed. They're not. So in those countries, you wouldn't expect the culture of cuteness because there's no need for it, right? It's more a reaction against this ultra competitive society that includes not just politics, but educational system and the economic system, right? But in countries that have plenty of natural resources, where people are happier and less ambitious, then no need for this culture of cuteness. So maybe Brazil, in some sense, doesn't have it because it's a happier society. Maybe, I don't know. Now, how can leaders remain self-critical? I mean, this is a huge issue. And so you do have it. The collective leadership system is important, because within that collective leadership, again, from my own personal experience serving as dean, how it works is each leader presents their views, and then you're criticized by their leaders. So within this collective leadership, if it works well, the leaders are critical of each other and also self-critical. And so the bad ideas tend to get knocked down through this discourse. But of course, we don't really know now what happens at the top, right? It's so mysterious. In Imperial China, you had historians who would record the words and actions of leaders. So you would know in history what happened. But now we don't know. Maybe there's a camera there that films it and it'll be released 50 years from now. We don't know. So it is worrisome. It is, because we don't know. Some people say now that the current leader, he has his trusted allies among the fellow leaders at the top, which might actually be good for criticism, because if you trust each other, it's easier to confront each other, right? Whereas if it's people who represent different factions, then you worry that if you're too honest with them, they might undermine you. So maybe it's actually better than before, because it's the current leader with his trusted allies, but we don't know. So, and frankly, this is a big problem, because you've had hugely mistaken policies. I was in China during COVID, and the first 2 years were wonderful. I mean, China really clamped down hard, but but we couldn't travel outside of China, so I couldn't go back to Canada during those 3 years. But within China, it was wonderful. The rest of the world felt like it was poisoned. But within China, we had a zero COVID policy. We could travel all within China. I never once experienced lockdown, felt completely free within this huge country. I did more traveling in those 2 years than in the previous 15 years throughout this huge country. But then once Omicron hit, the old policies were no longer effective, and the country imposed these very, very harsh measures, including in Shanghai, where people are literally starving because they couldn't go out to buy food. It's crazy. It's a very wealthier part of China. So then nobody was openly challenging those policies. Obviously, it's a huge problem. And eventually there was huge, like literally open rebellion, throughout China. Eventually, almost overnight, the government switched. It was such a mistake. And if there had been open critical challenges of China early on in early 2022 when Omicron hit, and clearly the old policies didn't work, and nobody dared to challenge the old policies, this disaster could have been avoided. Arguably, the one child per family policy is similar, where maybe it worked in the early days, although that's controversial, but towards the end, it was clearly counterproductive and took much too long to change. So yes, there's definitely need for much more public accountability, where the leaders are openly challenged in order to avoid these huge mistakes. How that will happen in the future, I suspect there'll be a need for much more freedom of speech and some democratic forms of, freedom of speech is hugely important, and as well as some more open forms of contestation. I think that's, in order to avoid these mistakes, that's quite likely in the future, if to be optimistic, yeah.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Daniel. We're a little bit short on time, so one last question. There's a genuine concern about the possibility of this system of democracy at the bottom really work if you have meritocracy at the top. Because in the last instance, you have to respond to some higher authority in order to your policies be complied. So I would like you to elaborate a bit more about that. Isn't it a bit contradictory, democracy at the bottom with meritocratic authority at the top?
Well, that's really good. Yeah. So yes, on the face of it, because if you have leaders who are selected by meritocratic mechanisms at the top, who make policies for the whole country, and they're supposed to be enforced at the lower levels, including, for example, the one child per family policy, which was pretty ruthlessly enforced. And that leads to contradiction, where if it really was elections at villages, and most villagers would probably oppose those policies, and so therefore those democratic elections at lower levels would not be effective. Completely agree. But I think there's still a division of labor, where you have many local level issues that are not to be decided at higher levels. For example, like, just to give you an example, again, I was in Shandong University. I was actually in rural part of China when I was, the new campus was an hour from Qingdao. It was basically in a village. And there were questions like, in order to expand the university, we have to expropriate the farmers. And the question is, when to do so? How much should they be given in compensation as expropriation? So there you had local leaders who were elected by villages, who negotiated with the university authorities until some sort of deal was struck. So there's lots of issues that are more local in nature, where the higher level of policies are not necessarily effective. And there's this famous expression in China, that the emperor is far away, and there's mountains that protect people at the lower levels of government. So arguably, perhaps even most of the decision-making issues at low levels of government would be local issues, not issues that are from the central levels. And even if there are some from the central levels, by the time they get down to local levels, somehow they get very dissipated often. So there's still an important role for democratically elected officials at lower levels of government to determine policies that affect local levels, and as opposed to implementing policies set by higher levels of government. This would be my way of addressing this hugely important issue.
Thanks, Professor. Tem alguém mais que gostaria de perguntar? Alguma pergunta mais? Okay. Just another question here.
Oh.
Good morning, Professor. I am a PhD student in political science at the university. I would like to ask you, how do you deal with the fact that other neighboring countries like Japan and South Korea, and also in the case of Taiwan, they are also Confucianist societies which also implemented systems based on Keju in the development of their bureaucracies, but they were able to democratize despite this Confucianist basis. And they were also able to lift their countries out of poverty, like China. And I would like to ask you if the political meritocratic system has to be the end game, the political end game for China, or these countries can also provide elements for the future development of the Chinese political system. Thank you.
Yeah, that's a great question. And as you say, the Confucian heritage is shared by other East Asian countries and societies. Japan and South Korea, they're special cases, right? For one thing, they're not really completely independent. Their foreign policy is set by the US, right? That's a huge difference. That's not going to happen in the Chinese case. Taiwan is not a country, but Taiwan, the politics, the issues are very local in nature, right? There's no issue. Taiwan doesn't take, long-term planning on issues like climate change and energy transition. So it's very, very different in those societies, and so it's very hard. It's much harder for them, in some cases, because they adopted electoral mechanisms to plan for the long term or to think about global issues. And to have control over their own foreign policy. So I think the experience of those countries and societies cannot set a good model for China, in my humble opinion.
Thank you, Professor. We have one more question for you.
Professor Bell, I hosted you once in Campinas before the pandemic on a philosophy, Oriental philosophy.
Right, I remember.
Good, so it's nice to see you again. I've never met you personally, of course, but the one question I'm always interested in is how the regime uses public opinion polling. And I'm close to the Institute of Sociology of CAS, and they did 6 surveys in the very early days of COVID, and basically the policy that was formed because they realized people did not want to die. So they were prepared to make all sorts of sacrifices not to die. So they got that idea of the people. So there was no philosophical examination of freedom and stuff like that. So could you please comment maybe on your perception of the degree to which public opinion polling, which is a form of democracy in a way, and Max Weber had that idea that every complex society can only really be ruled by consent. He obviously hadn't seen Stalin by that time, but could you just comment, please, on the role you see of public opinion polling playing in that?
Yeah, thanks. My information is a little bit out of date. So when I was in Beijing, I knew that the largest public private polling organization, I think it was called Horizons, their major customer was the Chinese Communist Party. They really, on major issues, they wanted to know what the people think to inform or maybe set constraints on some of the policy making. I don't know to what extent that's still true nowadays. I do know that when it comes to selecting leaders or for promotion, that the Department of Organization, which is like the human resources department for the Chinese Communist Party, they also rely to an extent on public polling to see how popular or not those leaders are. But it won't necessarily be the final thing that kind of influences decision making. But I guess it's part of the decision making. On the COVID issue, I think it's part of it that, of course, people don't want to die. I mean, that's a universal trait, right? But what's quite distinctive about the Chinese context is that there was also very strong concern for protecting the elderly, because this Confucian value of filial piety is still so central to the way of life in China. So people are more willing to make sacrifices for disease that was especially dangerous for the elderly. I think that's one way in which, I'm not sure to what extent that view was determined by public polling, but my intuition is that knowledge of the widely influential, the wide influence of the value of filial piety helped to influence the decision making during COVID. Yeah, but I don't really have the evidence to support that intuition.
Thanks a lot.
Nice. Quer perguntar? So, Professor, I think we don't have any more questions here in the room. So we would like to thank you very much for this conversation. It was very instructive for us. And I hope you had a good time here too.
It was my honor, and it was really fantastic questions, and I look forward to more discussion in the future.
Thank you, for sure. We're going to invite you again. So thank you, Professor. See you again.
Okay. Thank you. Have a wonderful conference. Thank you. Okay, I'll exit now. Bye.
Bye-bye. Bom, gente, então, é isso. Obrigado por hoje.